They say you never truly know someone until they're gone. I learned that the hardest way possible, by discovering that the man I loved, the man I trusted with my soul, the man an entire town revered as a shepherd of God, was a predator who hid behind a collar and a Bible. My name is Clara May Hartwell, and this is the story of how I went from being a pastor's widow to the woman who burned down everything I thought was sacred. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse and the abuse of power in our communities. Now let me tell you what really happened. The smell of casseroles had finally faded from the house. It had been 6 weeks since James's funeral, 6 weeks since I stood in that receiving line shaking hands with what felt like half of Georgia, accepting condolences from people who loved my husband more than they ever knew me. He was such a good man, they said. A pillar of this community. With the Lord now, Sister Clara. I nodded and smiled through my grief like a good pastor's wife should, even though that's all I was now. The ghost of someone's role, no longer needed but not yet dismissed. The church elders had been kind in their way. They told me to take all the time I needed before clearing out James's study. No rush, Sister Clara, Deacon Pritchard had said, patting my hand with his liver-spotted fingers. The church will always be your home. But I could feel the truth underneath those words. I lived in the parsonage, church property. Without James, I was just a tenant on borrowed time. That's why I started sorting through his things on a gray Tuesday morning in late October. The leaves outside were burning orange and red, and I thought maybe if I could just get through his belongings, I could figure out what came next. Who was Clara without James? I had no idea. His study was exactly as he'd left it. The big oak desk he'd inherited from his father, who'd also been a preacher. The walls lined with theological books and commentaries. The leather chair where he'd spent so many evenings preparing sermons. I'd rarely entered this room during our marriage. James always said it was his sacred space, where he communed with God and prepared his heart for ministry. I respected that. I respected everything about James. I started with the bookshelves, running my fingers along the spines. Maybe I'd donate most of these to the church library. Then I moved to the desk drawers. The top ones were easy, pens, notepads, sticky notes with scripture references. Normal pastor things. The bottom right drawer wouldn't open. I pulled harder, thinking it was just stuck. Nothing. I felt around the edges and realized there was a lock, a small brass keyhole I'd never noticed before. 20 years of marriage, and I'd never known this drawer locked. Why would James lock a drawer in his own private study? I searched through his key ring, the one that had been in his pocket the day he collapsed during the deacon's meeting. House keys, car keys, church keys. Nothing that fit this lock. For the first time since his death, I felt something other than grief. I felt curious. Then suspicious. Then almost angry at myself for feeling suspicious. This was James, my James. He probably just kept important church documents in there, financial records or something. But then why didn't the elders ask for the key when they inventoried the church property? I sat back in his chair and stared at that drawer for a long time. Outside, I heard Mrs. Chen next door calling her cat. A car passed by. The ordinary sounds of Redemption Falls going about its day. I got up and went to the kitchen. Found the screwdriver in the junk drawer. Came back. My hands shook as I wedged the screwdriver into the lock. I'd never broken anything of James's before. Never invaded his privacy. Even now, I felt like I was betraying him. The lock gave way with a crack that sounded too loud in the quiet house. Inside the drawer was a single leather-bound journal, the kind with a strap that wrapped around it. The leather was worn smooth, like it had been handled often. I lifted it out. It was heavy, full of pages. My heart was pounding as I unwrapped the strap and opened to the first page. Private Counseling Sessions, Confidential, was written in James's neat handwriting at the top. Below that, January 2009 present. I turned the page. January 14, 2009 session with Jennifer Morrison, age 34. Came to me in tears about her marriage. Husband doesn't attend church. She confessed to having feelings for someone else. I told her this was a spiritual crisis that required ongoing private counseling. She agreed. Used Matthew 5:28 to establish the severity of her sin. She will need to prove her repentance through increased tithing and service. Also secured her promise not to discuss these sessions with anyone, including her husband. Explained that he wouldn't understand spiritual matters. My stomach turned cold. I flipped ahead. Page after page of entries, names I knew. Women from our congregation. The dates, their ages, their confessions. March 3, 2010. Follow up with Sarah Bennett. She's still struggling with her daughter's rebellion. In today's session, she admitted she sometimes wishes she'd never had children. Used this to reinforce her need for my guidance. Reminded her that such thoughts, if spoken publicly, would destroy her reputation as a mother. She understands the need for discretion. Suggested a monthly donation to our special ministry fund. Sarah. My closest friend Sarah. I'd known her for 15 years. She'd never mentioned any of this. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the journal. I kept reading, unable to stop, even though each page made me feel sicker. The entries went on for years. Dozens of women. The pattern was always the same. James would identify someone vulnerable, offer private counseling, extract confessions or create situations where they'd feel they'd sinned, then use shame and spiritual authority to keep them silent and compliant. Some entries were worse, much worse. June 2016, Michelle Crane has become resistant to counseling. May need to remind her of what we discussed regarding her past. She wouldn't want her husband or the church board to know about the abortion before they were married. Her cooperation is essential. That wasn't counseling. That was blackmail. I read until the light outside changed from morning to afternoon. I read until my eyes burned and my throat ached from crying. I read until I reached the last entry, dated just 3 days before James died. October A10 met with Catherine Wells. She's threatening to stop the sessions, says she wants to talk to another pastor. Reminded her that I have documentation of everything she's confessed. She backed down. These women need to understand that spiritual authority exists for their own good. They would fall apart without proper guidance. I closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness of the study. The man I loved had been a monster. The man I'd trusted had been a predator. And I was the only person who knew. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the journal in front of me, a cup of tea going cold in my hands. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's face. Not the kind man I thought I'd married, but someone else. A stranger wearing his smile. How had I not known? How had I lived with him for 20 years and never suspected? But even as I asked myself these questions, I knew the answer. I hadn't wanted to see. James had been charming, devoted to his ministry, respected by everyone. And I had been the dutiful wife, content to stay in the background, teaching Sunday school and organizing potlucks. I never questioned him, I never pushed. Maybe that's what he'd counted on. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't keep this to myself. These women deserved to know that their secrets were written down, documented. They deserved to know what James had done. But who could I tell? The church elders. They'd protected James for years. Surely they must have suspected something. The police. What crime had been committed exactly? Manipulation wasn't illegal. Spiritual abuse wasn't something you could arrest someone for. I thought of the women in the journal. There were at least 20 names, maybe more. Some I knew well. Others I barely recognized. But one name kept coming back to me, Sarah Bennett. Sarah had been my friend since the day James and I arrived in Redemption Falls. She'd welcomed us with a pecan pie and a warm smile. Our daughters had played together until Sarah's girl, Emma, went off to college. We'd had coffee together every Thursday morning for years. And according to the journal, James had been manipulating her since 2010. I needed to talk to her. Maybe if I approached her carefully, explained what I'd found, she'd help me understand what to do next. Maybe she'd know if the other women would want to come forward. I called her that morning, my hands shaking as I dialed. Clara. Sarah's voice was cautious. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral. How are you holding up, Sarah? I need to talk to you. Can I come by? There was a long pause. Is this about church business? Because I've been meaning to tell you, I've decided to take a step back from the women's ministry for a while. I think it's time for some new leadership. It's not about church business. It's personal. Please, Sarah, it's important. Another pause, longer this time. All right, come by this afternoon, 2 o'clock. Sarah's house was a tidy ranch on Maple Street with a garden she tended religiously. She met me at the door, and I was struck by how tired she looked. There were shadows under her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Come in, she said, not quite meeting my gaze. I made coffee. We sat in her living room, the same room where we'd had so many conversations over the years. But something felt different now. The air was heavy with things unsaid. I held the journal in my lap, my fingers gripping it tightly. Sarah, I found something in James's study. Something I think you need to see. Her whole body went rigid. What do you mean, a journal? He kept records of private counseling sessions. With women from the church? I watched her face carefully. Your name is in it, Sarah. The color drained from her cheeks. No, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I had to tell you, I had to. Stop. Sarah stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. You need to leave, Clara. What? No, Sarah, please listen. I don't want to hear this. Her voice was rising now, something desperate and angry in it. Whatever you think you found, whatever you think you know, just let it go. Let him rest in peace. Rest in peace. I stood up too, the journal clutched against my chest. Sarah, he manipulated you. He manipulated all of you. He used your confessions against you, made you pay money, kept you silent. He helped me. The words burst out of her, raw and fierce. When I was falling apart, when I couldn't handle Emma's problems, when I thought I was going crazy. James was there. He listened. He understood. He exploited you? I said softly. Sarah, this wasn't help. This was abuse. She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You don't understand anything. You were his wife, Clara. You gotta be the perfect one, the one everyone admired. The rest of us, we were just trying to survive. And James gave us a place to fall apart where no one else would see. At what cost? I asked. What did he make you do to keep those secrets? Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might tell me everything. But then she straightened, and her expression hardened. Get out of my house. And if you know what's good for you, you'll burn that journal and never speak of this again. Sarah. The elders know Clara. Her voice was cold now. They've always known. And they won't let you destroy this church over one man's indiscretions. This community needs its faith. People need to believe in something good. If you take that away from them, you'll have nothing left. No home, no friends, no place here. Is that what you want? I stared at her, this woman I'd thought I knew. How can you defend him? I'm not defending him. Her voice cracked. I'm protecting myself, and you should do the same. I left Sarah's house in a daze. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock my car door. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel trying to breathe. The elders knew. Of course they knew. How could they not? And Sarah was right about one thing. If I exposed this, I would lose everything. My home, my place in the community, maybe even my safety. The church was the center of Redemption Falls. People's entire identities were wrapped up in it. If I tore that down, they'd never forgive me. But how could I live with myself if I stayed silent? I was still sitting there, paralyzed by indecision, when I saw a car pull up across the street. A woman got out, someone I hadn't seen in years but recognized immediately. Rebecca Cole. Becca. She'd been 3 years behind me in school, the daughter of Mrs. Cole who lived on the edge of town. Becca had left Redemption Falls 10 years ago under a cloud of scandal. She'd been an investigative reporter for the local paper and had exposed an affair involving a city councilman. But it turned out the situation was more complicated than her initial story suggested, and she'd been accused of sensationalizing and destroying a man's reputation unfairly. She'd left town in disgrace. Now here she was, pulling a suitcase from her trunk, looking older and more tired than I remembered. She was going into her mother's house. I remembered hearing that Mrs. Cole had been ill. I sat there watching her, an idea forming in my mind. An idea that felt both desperate and necessary. Becca Cole was a journalist. She'd investigated stories, exposed wrongdoing. She'd also been burned by this town, cast out and humiliated. She had every reason to want the truth to come out. And she was the only person in Redemption Falls who didn't owe the church anything. Before I could talk myself out of it, I got out of my car and crossed the street. Becca. I called out. Becca Cole. She turned, squinting at me in the afternoon sun. Yes? My name is Clara Hartwell. I need your help. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, come inside. Something tells me this is going to be quite a story. Mrs. Cole's house smelled like lavender and old books. Becca led me through a cluttered living room to a small kitchen where boxes were stacked against the walls. She cleared off 2 chairs at a worn table and gestured for me to sit. Excuse the mess, she said, filling a kettle with water. I just got back yesterday. Mom's in the hospital. Pneumonia. I'm here to pack up the house and figure out what comes next. She set the kettle on the stove and turned to face me. Now Clara Hartwell. Pastor Hartwell's widow, if I remember correctly. Yes. I set the journal on the table between us, my hands still trembling. And I need to tell you something about my husband that's going to sound impossible. Becca leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. I've been a journalist for 15 years, Mrs. Hartwell. Very little sounds impossible to me anymore. So I told her. Everything. The locked drawer, the journal, the entries spanning 15 years. The blackmail, the manipulation, the women's names. Sarah's reaction. The elders' knowledge. Becca listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. May I see it? She finally asked, nodding at the journal. I pushed it across the table. She opened it carefully, reading several entries with the focused attention of someone used to examining evidence. The kettle began to whistle, but she ignored it. This is... She trailed off, flipping through more pages. Mrs. Hartwell, do you understand what you have here? A record of my husband's crimes. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Maybe? Probably. She closed the journal and finally tended to the kettle, pouring us both tea. But also something much harder to prosecute. Spiritual abuse isn't well defined in legal terms. What he did, manipulating confessions, demanding money, threatening exposure, it's unethical, it's monstrous, but proving it crossed into criminal territory would be difficult. My heart sank. So there's nothing we can do. I didn't say that. She sat down across from me, wrapping her hands around her mug. I said it would be difficult. But difficult isn't impossible. The question is, what do you want to happen here? Do you want justice, exposure, protection for these women? Revenge? I stopped, realizing I hadn't thought that far ahead. I want the truth to come out. I want these women to know they weren't alone, that what happened to them wasn't their fault. I want the church leadership held accountable, noble goals. Becca's tone wasn't mocking, but it wasn't entirely warm either. But let me be very clear about what that means, Mrs. Hartwell. If we pursue this, your life in Redemption Falls is over. You'll lose your home, your friends, your reputation. The church will paint you as a bitter widow trying to destroy your husband's legacy. Some people will believe them. Sarah already warned me about that. Sarah Bennett. Becca raised an eyebrow. She's one of the names in there. I nodded. And she told you to bury it. Becca took a sip of her tea. That tells us something important. These women are terrified. They've been conditioned to protect their abuser even after he's dead. Getting them to talk, to go on record, that's going to be nearly impossible. Then why are you even considering helping me? The question came out sharper than I intended. If it's impossible, if I'm going to lose everything, why not just tell me to burn the journal and move on? Becca set down her mug and looked at me with something like respect. Because 10 years ago I tried to expose a man in power who was hurting people. I thought I had the full story. I didn't. My reporting was sloppy, incomplete, and I destroyed reputations without understanding all the facts. I left this town in disgrace, and I deserved it. She leaned forward. But I've learned since then. I've learned how to investigate properly, how to verify sources, how to build an airtight case. And I've learned that sometimes the stories that are hardest to tell are the ones that matter most. Her jaw set. This town cast me out for being wrong. Maybe it's time they see what I look like when I get it right. So you'll help me. On one condition. Her voice was firm. Would do this my way, methodically, carefully. No rushing to expose anything until we have corroborating evidence. No confronting the elders until we know exactly what we're up against. And most importantly, we protect these women's identities unless they explicitly consent to going public. Agreed. I thought about Sarah's terrified face, about the 20+ names in that journal, about the years of silence and shame. Agreed. Good. Becca pulled a laptop from one of the boxes. Then let's start with what we know. I need you to tell me everything about your husband's routine, his relationships with church leadership, his finances, everything. We worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Becca asked hundreds of questions, taking notes on her laptop with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this before. She wanted to know about James's schedule, who he met with privately, whether there were any financial irregularities I'd noticed. I told her what I could, but the truth was I hadn't paid much attention. I'd been content to let James handle everything, to be the supportive wife who didn't ask too many questions. Don't beat yourself up, Becca said when she noticed my expression. Abusers are good at hiding, that's why they succeed. Around 7 o'clock I got a text message. My heart stopped when I saw the name Deacon Earl Pritchard. Sister Clara, the elders would like to meet with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the church. We have some matters to discuss regarding your housing situation and James's belongings. Please confirm. I showed the message to Becca. Her expression darkened. That's fast. Sarah must have called them right after you left. What do I do? You go to the meeting. Becca's fingers flew across her keyboard. But you're going to wear a wire. What? She looked up at me. I still have some of my old recording equipment. You'll wear a small microphone to the meeting. We need to know what the elders know, what they're planning, and most importantly, whether they'll incriminate themselves. Isn't that illegal? Georgia is a one-party consent state, Becca said. As long as you're part of the conversation, you can legally record it. And Mrs. Hartwell, if those elders threaten you, if they try to intimidate you into silence, we need proof. This journal is evidence of what James did, but we need evidence of the cover-up too. My mouth was dry. This is really happening. This is really happening, Becca confirmed. The question is, are you ready? Because once you walk into that meeting tomorrow, there's no going back. They're going to try to silence you. Maybe with kindness, maybe with threats. Can you hold your ground? I thought about the women in that journal, about Sarah's desperate eyes, about the years of secrets and shame and silence. I can hold my ground, I said. That night I went home to the empty parsonage and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I imagined tomorrow's meeting. Deacon Pritchard with his fatherly voice and his iron will. Walter Gibson, the chairman of the church board, who'd known James since seminary. Elder Margaret Simmons, who'd been like a second mother to me. They were going to try to make me disappear this problem. And I was going to have to look them in the eye and pretend I might cooperate, all while recording every word they said. Around midnight, another text came through. This one was from a number I didn't recognize. You're making a mistake, Clara. Some secrets are better left buried. For everyone's sake. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Then I screenshot it and sent it to Becca. Her response came immediately: save all threats. Document everything. I'll pick you up at 9:30 a.m. We've got work to do. I lay back down, but sleep never came. Instead, I lay in the darkness thinking about James, about the life I'd thought we had, about the man I'd loved who'd never really existed. And I thought about the morning ahead, when I would walk into that church, my home for 20 years, and begin the process of tearing it all down. Becca arrived at 9:30 sharp, carrying a small canvas bag. She looked professional in dark slacks and a blazer, her hair pulled back, every inch the serious journalist. I dressed carefully too. A modest navy dress, the kind I'd worn to 1,000 church functions. The kind that said I was still the grieving pastor's widow, respectful and subdued. Let me show you how this works, Becca said, pulling out what looked like a small button from her bag. This is a wireless microphone. It'll clip inside your collar right here. She demonstrated on her own shirt. The transmitter goes in your pocket or clips to your waistband. It's small enough that no one will notice. My hands shook as she helped me attach the equipment. What if they find it? They won't. And if they do, you tell them the truth. You're recording for your own records, because you want to make sure you understand everything they're telling you about your housing situation. That's completely reasonable for a widow dealing with complicated church property issues. She met my eyes. But Clara, they're not going to search you. That would be too obvious, too aggressive. They're going to try charm first. And if charm doesn't work, then we'll see what they really are. She adjusted the microphone one last time. Remember, your job is to listen. Let them talk. Ask clarifying questions. Don't reveal that you know about the journal's contents or the extent of what James did. You're just a confused widow trying to understand her husband's legacy. I nodded, my throat tight. I'll be in my car in the church parking lot, recording everything. If something goes wrong, if you feel unsafe, just say the word uncomfortable, and I'll come in. She squeezed my hand. You can do this. The church looked the same as it always had. White clapboard with a tall steeple, the sign out front still displaying last Sunday's sermon title, Walking in Faith. James had preached that sermon 2 weeks before he died. I'd sat in the front pew nodding along, believing every word. How many lies had I believed? I walked up the familiar steps and through the heavy wooden doors. The sanctuary was empty, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the pews. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like a trap. Sister Clara. Deacon Pritchard's voice echoed from the hallway. We're in the conference room. Dear. I followed his voice down the hallway past James's old office. My old office too, where I'd taught Sunday school and planned vacation Bible school. The conference room door was open. 3 people sat around the table: Deacon Earl Pritchard, Chairman Walter Gibson, and Elder Margaret Simmons. They'd set out coffee in store, bought cookies like this was a social call. Clara dear, come sit. Margaret gestured to the chair across from them. Her smile was warm, grandmotherly. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I said, taking my seat. The microphone felt heavy against my chest, even though it weighed almost nothing. Thank you for asking. We've been worried about you, Walter Gibson said. He was a large man with silver hair and a booming preacher's voice, though he'd never taken the pulpit. Grieving alone in that big parsonage, it can't be easy. The congregation has been very supportive, I said carefully. Of course, of course. Deacon Pritchard folded his hands on the table. He had a kind face, the face of everyone's favorite grandfather. But Clara, we need to talk about practical matters. The parsonage, James's belongings, your future here in Redemption Falls. I've been meaning to sort through his things, I said. I'm sorry if I've been slow about it. No apologies necessary. Margaret reached across and patted my hand. You take all the time you need. But Earl raises a good point about the parsonage. It's church property, and eventually we'll need it for the next pastor. I understand. Do you? Walter leaned forward slightly. Because we want to be very clear, Clara. The church will take care of you. We have a small fund set aside for situations like this. We can help you find an apartment in town, cover your first few months' rent, help you get on your feet. It sounded generous. It sounded kind. But underneath, I heard the message: leave. Leave quietly. That's very thoughtful, I said. I appreciate the church's generosity. There's just one thing, Deacon Pritchard said, his voice still gentle. We've heard some concerning rumors about you going through James's private papers. My heart hammered against my ribs. I've been sorting through his belongings, yes, like you suggested. His office belongings specifically. Walter's eyes were sharp now, despite his friendly tone. His desk. His locked drawer. They knew. Of course they knew. Sarah must have told them everything. I needed to go through everything to know what to keep and what to give away. I said, keeping my voice steady. Is that a problem? Not at all. Margaret said quickly. We're just concerned that you might have found some things that That might be confusing out of context. Confusing. James was a counselor as well as a pastor. Deacon Pritchard explained. He kept detailed notes of his sessions with parishioners. Very detailed. It was part of his process, his way of helping people. Those notes are confidential, Clara, Walter added. The women who confided in James, they trusted him with their deepest struggles. They wouldn't want those private matters becoming public knowledge. I see. I took a sip of coffee, buying time to think. So you're saying James's counseling records should remain private? Absolutely, Margaret said. For everyone's sake, including yours. Including mine? Well, dear. Margaret's smile was sad now, pitying. If people knew that James had documented all those private confessions, all those struggles, it might change how they remember him, and by extension how they see you. There it was. The threat wrapped in sympathy. We know you love James, Deacon Pritchard said. We know you want to protect his legacy, so we're hoping, that you'll let us take care of those sensitive materials. We'll ensure they're properly disposed of, and no one ever needs to know they existed. Disposed of, I repeated. For everyone's protection, Walter confirmed. It's what James would have wanted. He always put his flock first. I looked at their faces. These people I'd known for 20 years, these pillars of the church, these supposed shepherds of the faith. And I saw what they really were: guardians of a lie, protectors of a predator, people who'd chosen reputation over truth. What if I don't want to give you the materials? I asked quietly. The room went very still. Clara, Margaret said slowly. That would be unwise. Unwise how? Deacon Pritchard sighed, like I was forcing his hand. Clara, this church is your home, your community. Your entire life is here. If you were to make trouble, if you were to spread rumors or accusations about James after he can't defend himself, well, I'm afraid you'd find yourself very alone. Wa'd hate to see you lose everything, Walter added. Your friends, your place here, your reputation. But if you force our hand, if you refuse to do what's right? What's right? The words burst out of me before I could stop them. What's right is telling the truth. What's right is letting those women know that what happened to them wasn't spiritual counseling. It was abuse. Margaret's face hardened. Lower your voice. What James did was wrong. I continued, my voice shaking but strong. He manipulated vulnerable women. He extracted their secrets and used them for control. That's enough. Walter stood up, his bulk suddenly intimidating. You're grieving, Clara, you're not thinking clearly. James was a good man who helped countless people. If you can't see that, if you're going to spit on his memory. I found the journal, I said. I read it, all of it. I know what he did to Sarah, to Jennifer, to Michelle, to all of them. The silence that followed was deafening. Deacon Pritchard's kind expression melted away, replaced with something cold and calculating. Then you understand why those records must be destroyed. For everyone's sake, Clara, including the women you claim to want to help. They deserve to know. They deserve to move on. Margaret's voice was sharp now, all pretense of warmth gone. They deserve to keep their secrets buried, their reputations intact, their families ignorant. You think you're helping them. You'll destroy them. And yourself, Walter added. Make no mistake, Clara. If you try to expose this, we will fight you. We will protect this church and James's legacy with everything we have. You'll be branded as a vindictive, mentally unstable widow. No one will believe you. Some people will, I said, thinking of Becca in the parking lot, recording every word. Not enough. Deacon Pritchard stood as well, his voice final. You have until Sunday to vacate the parsonage. You can take your personal belongings. Everything else stays. And Clara, he leaned forward, his eyes hard. That journal, you never found it. It doesn't exist. Are we clear? I stood up, my legs shaky but holding. Perfectly clear. Good. Margaret stood too, smoothing her skirt. We'll have the locks changed on Monday. I'm sorry it came to this, Clara. We really did want to help you. I'm sure you did. I said quietly. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, through the sanctuary where I'd worshipped for 20 years, out the doors into the bright October morning. Becca was waiting by her car, her face grim. She held up her laptop. I got every word. They threatened me. I said, my voice surprisingly steady. They admitted they knew. They're covering it up. I know. She opened the car door for me. Get in. We have a lot of work to do. And you have exactly 4 days to build a case that will blow this whole thing wide open. I got in the car and looked back at the church one more time. My home, my prison, my past. Let's burn it down, I said. Becca smiled grimly. Now you're talking. Becca's mother's house became our headquarters. We cleared the dining room table and spread out everything we had: the journal, transcripts of the recording from my meeting with the elders, a timeline Becca had created on a large whiteboard she'd found in the garage. We have 4 days until Sunday, Becca said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. 4 days to gather enough evidence and testimony to make this undeniable. The journal and the recording are good, but they're not enough. Why not? I asked. You heard what the elders said. They admitted they knew. They admitted they knew James kept counseling records. They didn't explicitly admit to covering up abuse. A good lawyer could spin that recording as church leaders trying to protect confidential pastoral records. She tapped her marker against the board. We need victims willing to go on record. We need documentation of the money James extorted. We need proof that this was systematic, intentional, and known by leadership. The women won't talk. Sarah made that clear. Some won't, Becca agreed. But maybe some will. We just have to find the right one. She opened the journal to a page she'd marked. Tell me about Michelle Crane. I remembered Michelle. A quiet woman in her late 30s, married to Tom Crane, who owned the hardware store. They had 2 kids, both in high school now. She stopped coming to church about 2 years ago. People said she'd found another congregation, but I always wondered. According to this entry from 2016, James was blackmailing her about an abortion she'd had before she was married. Becca's voice was matter of fact, but I could see the anger in her eyes. She stopped coming right around the time James made this note to Michelle's resistance is becoming problematic. May need to be more direct. You think he threatened her? I think he pushed too hard and she got away from him, which means she might be angry enough to talk. Becca was already typing on her laptop. She's on social media, still lives in town, works at the library. I can't just show up and ask her to relive her trauma. You're right, you can't. Becca looked up at me, but I can. I'm a journalist. She doesn't know me, doesn't have history with me. And Clara. Sometimes it's easier to tell your story to a stranger than to someone who knew your abuser. It made sense, but it felt wrong somehow. These are real people, Becca. Not just sources for a story. I know that. Her voice was gentle but firm. And that's exactly why we have to do this right. These women have been silenced for years. If even one of them is ready to speak, ready to be heard, then we owe it to her to listen. And to make sure the world listens too. While Becca went to find Michelle, I had another task: James's finances. If he'd been extorting money from these women, there had to be a trail. I logged into our joint bank account, something I'd rarely done during our marriage. James had always handled the money, said it was one less thing for me to worry about. I'd been such a fool. The checking account was straightforward: his pastoral salary, my small income from teaching Sunday school, normal expenses. But then I noticed regular transfers to another account, one I didn't recognize, small amounts, usually a few $100s at a time, always on the 15th of each month. I called the bank. After 20 minutes of security questions and proving I was James's widow, I finally got answers. The account was a separate savings account James had opened 5 years ago. The balance made my stomach turn over $40,000. Can you tell me where the deposits came from? I asked the banker. Most were cash deposits made in person, she said. But there are also some checks. Let me pull up the imaging, looks like they're from various individuals. Can you email me copies of those records? Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm very sorry for your loss. I hung up and stared at the number on the screen. $40,000. Money from women he'd manipulated and blackmailed, squirreled away in a secret account. My phone rang. It was Becca. Talk to Michelle, she said without preamble. She'll meet with us. Tonight. But Clara, she's fragile. Whatever you do, don't push. Let her tell her story in her own time. We met Michelle at a coffee shop 2 towns over, far from Redemption Falls and prying eyes. She arrived wearing sunglasses even though it was already dark outside, and she sat with her back to the wall, watching the door like she expected someone to burst through it. Thank you for meeting with us, Becca said gently. I know this isn't easy. Michelle took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. When you called and told me about the journal, I thought I'd finally moved past it. I thought you are safe, I said. James is gone. He can't hurt you anymore. But his legacy isn't gone. Michelle's hands trembled around her coffee cup. His reputation, the church's protection of him, that's all still there, and I'm still here, still carrying his secrets like they're mine to keep. They're not, Becca said. They never were. What James did to you, that was his sin, not yours. Michelle laughed bitterly. Try telling that to this town. Try telling that to my husband, who doesn't know about the abortion, who thinks I just stopped going to church because I needed a break. She looked at me. Do you know what it's like, Clara? To have someone own your past. To know that one wrong move and everything you've built could come crashing down. I'm learning, I said quietly. I'm learning that the man I married was a stranger. That my whole life was built on lies. At least you didn't know. Michelle's voice cracked. I knew, for years. I knew what he was doing to me, and I let it happen because I was too afraid of the alternative. Tell us, Becca urged gently. Tell us what happened. So Michelle told her story. It poured out of her like water from a broken dam. How she'd gone to James for marriage counseling, how he'd slowly extracted more and more personal information, how he'd discovered her secret about the abortion, and used it to keep her coming back, keep her paying money into the special ministry fund, keep her silent. He said God had revealed my sin to him. Michelle said, tears streaming down her face. He said he was helping me atone. And I believed him because he was the pastor, because everyone said he was such a good man, because I thought maybe I deserved it. You didn't, I said fiercely. You didn't deserve any of it. Will you go on record? Becca asked. Will you let us tell your story? Anonymously if you prefer, but officially enough that it can't be ignored. Michelle was quiet for a long time. If I do this, I lose everything. My husband will know. The whole town will know. My kids. If you don't do this, Becca said carefully, the next pastor might be just like James. The elders will keep protecting their reputation instead of their people. And every woman in that journal will keep carrying shame that doesn't belong to her. I need to think about it, Michelle said. I need time. We don't have much time, I admitted. They're evicting me on Sunday. After that, I won't have access to church records, and they'll do everything they can to discredit me. Sunday, Michelle repeated. She closed her eyes. That's the town hall meeting about the church expansion. I'd forgotten about that. The church had been planning to build a new wing, a project James had been passionate about. The town hall meeting was supposed to be a formality, a public forum to discuss the plans before the city council voted on the permits. Everyone will be there, Michelle continued. The whole town, the church leadership, the mayor. She opened her eyes and looked at me. If you're going to expose this, that's when you should do it. That's public, Becca said slowly. Very public. Clara, if you do this at the town hall, there's no controlling the narrative, no carefully releasing information. It'll be chaos. Good, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Let it be chaos. Let everyone see the truth all at once, in front of the whole town, where the elders can't spin it or bury it. Michelle smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. If you do that, if you really stand up there and expose them, I'll stand with you. I can't promise I'll say much, but I'll stand there. So they know you're not lying. So they know it was real. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me yet, Michelle said. You have no idea how ugly this is going to get. We left the coffee shop with a plan and a deadline. 3 days to gather as much evidence as possible. 3 days to convince at least a few more women to stand with us. 3 days before I walked into that town hall meeting and destroyed everything James had built. On the drive back to Redemption Falls, Becca glanced over at me. You know there's no coming back from this, right? After Sunday, you can never be that person again. The dutiful pastor's wife, the woman who goes along to get along. Good, I said, watching the dark countryside roll past. I don't want to be her anymore. My phone buzzed with a text. Another unknown number, last warning. Walk away now or face the consequences. I showed it to Becca. She just shook her head. They're scared, that's good. Scared people make mistakes. They're also dangerous. So are we, Becca said grimly. So are we. The next 2 days were a blur. Becca worked her contacts, making calls to journalists in Atlanta, documenting everything meticulously. I went through James's financial records with a forensic accountant Becca knew, a woman named Patricia who'd left Redemption Falls years ago, but still remembered the church's influence. $43,000 over 5 years. Patricia said, highlighting entries on her laptop. Most of it cash deposits, but these checks here. She pointed to the screen. These match dates in the journal when James noted special contributions from specific women. This is a paper trail, Clara. This is proof. But proof wasn't enough if no one would listen. We needed voices. We needed women willing to stand up. I spent hours trying to reach the women named in the journal. Most didn't answer my calls. 2 hung up as soon as they heard my name. 1, Jennifer Morrison, screamed at me to leave her alone before blocking my number. By Friday afternoon, I was exhausted and discouraged. Becca found me sitting on her mother's porch, staring at nothing. We have Michelle, she reminded me, sitting down beside me. That's one voice. That's a start. One voice against an entire church, an entire town's power structure. I shook my head. Maybe the elders are right. Maybe I'm just going to destroy these women all over again. Or maybe you're giving them the chance to finally be free. Becca pulled out her phone. I got an email an hour ago. From someone who read about what we're doing. How did anyone read about it? We haven't published anything. Small towns, Clara. Word travels. Especially when church elders start making calls, warning people not to talk to the disturbed widow. She smiled slightly. But sometimes warnings backfire. Sometimes they make people curious. She showed me the email. It was from a woman named Catherine Wells. One of the last entries in James's journal, written just days before he died. Dear Ms. Cole, I heard you're investigating Pastor Hartwell. I left Redemption Falls Baptist 3 months ago after years of his counseling. I moved to Macon to get away from him. If you're really trying to expose what he did, I'll talk. I'll tell you everything. I have nothing left to lose. She's willing to do a phone interview. Becca said. Today, if we want. And Clara, there's more. I've been going through the church's financial records. The public ones, the ones they file with the city for their tax-exempt status. There are discrepancies. Money going to this special ministry fund that James controlled, but no accounting of where it went. He kept it, I said, the secret account. Exactly. Which means the church leadership either knew about the embezzlement and covered it up, or they were criminally negligent in their oversight. Either way, it's a scandal. Becca's eyes were bright with the intensity I'd seen in her before. She was in reporter mode now, following the story wherever it led. We call Catherine, we get her testimony, and we present everything Sunday night. Catherine Wells had a quiet voice, but there was strength underneath it. She spoke to us over speakerphone, Becca recording everything with Catherine's permission. I went to Pastor Hartwell because I was having doubts about my marriage, Catherine said. My husband and I had been fighting, and I thought maybe a pastor could help us find our way back to each other. But James, Pastor Hartwell, he insisted on seeing me alone. He said marital counseling worked better if he understood each person's perspective individually first. When did things change? Becca asked gently. Second session. He started asking very personal questions about my marriage. About intimacy. About my past relationships. I felt uncomfortable, but he said it was all part of spiritual healing. Catherine's voice wavered. By the fourth session he told me that I'd confessed to lustful thoughts about another man. Something I'd mentioned casually, just that I'd noticed someone was attractive, and that this was adultery of the heart. He had me read Matthew over and over. He made me feel like I was dirty, sinful beyond redemption. What happened then? I asked. He said I needed intensive counseling. Once a week minimum, and I needed to make restitution for my sin. Donations to his special ministry fund. He said it was the only way to prove I was serious about repentance. Catherine laughed bitterly. I gave him $500 a month for 2 years. I lied to my husband about where the money was going. I told him it was for a women's Bible study. Did he ever? Becca paused delicately. Did James ever cross physical boundaries? He touched my hands during prayer, hugged me too long. Once, he kissed my forehead and said I was special to God. Catherine's voice hardened. It never went further than that, but it felt wrong. Like he was testing how much I'd tolerate. When I finally told him I wanted to stop the sessions, he reminded me that he had documentation of everything I'd confessed. He said if I left, he'd have to share my struggles with the church leadership for accountability purposes. That's when you moved, I asked. That's when I ran, Catherine corrected. I told my husband the truth about everything. The sessions, the money, the manipulation. He didn't believe me at first. Pastor Hartwell was too respected, too beloved. But my husband saw how scared I was, and he agreed to move. We left Redemption Falls and started over. Her voice dropped. We're divorced now. He never could quite believe me about what James did. He thought I was making excuses for the money I'd spent, for the lies I'd told. The thing James did to us outlasted him. We talked to Catherine for another hour, getting every detail, every date, every manipulation. By the time we hung up, Becca had filled 10 pages with notes. That's 2 women, Becca said. 2 testimonies. Combined with the journal, the financial records, and the recording of the elders, we have a case. Will it be enough to convince everyone? No. Some people will never believe it, no matter how much evidence we present. Becca met my eyes. But it'll be enough to start a conversation, enough to force an investigation, enough to make sure James's victims know they weren't alone and they weren't crazy. My phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. I hadn't spoken to her since our confrontation at her house. Should I answer? I asked Becca. Put it on speaker. I answered. Hello, Sarah. Clara. Her voice was strained tight. I heard what you're planning to do Sunday night. The town hall. How did you? Earl Pritchard called me. He's calling everyone from the church, telling them you've had some kind of breakdown. That you're going to make wild accusations. She paused. He told me to make sure I'm there to refute anything you say about James. My heart sank. And will you? Silence stretched between us. Then, quietly, don't know. No, Sarah. I've been carrying this for so long, Clara. 13 years of sessions with James, of him knowing my darkest thoughts, my worst moments as a mother. 13 years of believing I needed him to keep me from falling apart. Her voice cracked. But you're right. What he did wasn't help. It was control. Then stand with me, I said. Stand with us on Sunday. If I do that, Emma will know. My daughter will know that her mother said terrible things about her, that I wished I'd never had her. Sarah was crying now. How do I tell my child that? You tell her that you were manipulated, I said gently. You tell her that someone in authority used your pain against you. You tell her that you're standing up now because you don't want anyone else to go through what you did. I'm so scared. Me too, I admitted. I'm terrified. But Sarah, we can't let fear win anymore. James used our fear to control us. The elders are using fear to silence us. If we give in now, nothing changes. More silence. Then, I'll be there Sunday. I won't speak. I can't, Clara, I just can't. But I'll sit in the front row. So people know you're not alone. Thank you, I whispered. After she hung up, I looked at Becca. 3 women enough. It's a start, she said. Now we prepare for war. Saturday passed in a haze of preparation. Becca wrote and rewrote her presentation, organizing the evidence into a clear timeline. I practiced what I would say, trying to find words that would make people understand without sensationalizing the pain these women had endured. That evening, I went back to the parsonage one last time. I'd been packing slowly all week, boxing up my life, but there were still things I needed to collect. Photographs. Books. The quilt my mother had made. I was in the bedroom when I heard the front door open. Clara. A familiar voice called out. Deacon Pritchard. My pulse quickened. I hadn't given him permission to enter. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. He stood in my entryway with Walter Gibson and Margaret Simmons. What are you doing here? I asked. We came to talk sense into you one last time, Deacon Pritchard said. He looked older than he had at our meeting warier. Clara, don't do this. Don't destroy everything James built, everything this church means to this community. James destroyed it himself. I said, coming down the stairs slowly. I'm just telling the truth. The truth. Margaret's voice was sharp. The truth is that James helped dozens of women through their darkest moments. Yes, he kept records. Yes, some of his methods were unorthodox. But he wasn't a monster, Clara. He was a man trying to do good in a complicated world. He was a blackmailer, I said flatly. He was an abuser who used God to justify his actions. You have no proof of that, Walter said. A journal full of counseling notes isn't proof of abuse. It's proof of a dedicated pastor's work. I almost laughed. I have recordings, financial records, testimony from his victims. Their expressions shifted, and I saw real fear there. If you present that tomorrow, Deacon Pritchard said slowly, we will have no choice but to protect the church. We'll expose every mistake you've ever made, every doubt you've ever expressed, every time you failed to be the perfect pastor's wife. We'll paint you as mentally unstable, vindictive, a woman so consumed by grief that she's turned against her husband's memory. Do it? I said. I don't care anymore. You should care, Margaret said, because we'll go after the women too. Every woman who stands with you will question their credibility. Sarah's struggles as a mother, public. Michelle's abortion, public. Catherine's marital problems, public. Is that what you want, Clara? To destroy these women in the name of saving them? The words hit like a physical blow. She was right. Exposing James meant exposing his victims too. No matter how carefully we presented it, their private pain would become public knowledge. But I thought about the $43,000 in James's secret account. I thought about Catherine, divorced and starting over because of James's manipulation. I thought about Sarah, carrying shame for 13 years that wasn't hers to carry. They've already been destroyed, I said quietly. At least this way, they get to fight back. Deacon Pritchard shook his head sadly. Then you leave us no choice. We'll see you tomorrow, Clara. God have mercy on you. They left, closing the door quietly behind them. I stood in the empty entryway of the house that had never really been mine, and I called Becca. They came to threaten me, I said. One last time. Did it work? I looked around at the home I was about to lose, at the life I was about to leave behind, at everything I'd built that was really just borrowed on someone else's terms. No, I said. Tomorrow, we tell the truth. Sunday morning I woke up in Becca's mother's guest room to the sound of church bells. Redemption Falls Baptist, calling the faithful to worship. I'd heard those bells every Sunday for 20 years. Today they sounded like a warning. I didn't go to church. For the first time since moving to this town, I stayed away. Instead, Becca and I spent the morning reviewing our presentation one final time, checking every fact, every citation, every piece of evidence. You don't have to do this, Becca said around noon. I could present it, you could stay in the background, knew. I was surprised by how calm I felt. This has to come from me. I was his wife. I'm the one who found the journal. If anyone else does it, they'll just say I'm hiding, that I'm too ashamed to show my face. You're braver than I gave you credit for, Becca said quietly. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock at the community center, a low brick building next to the courthouse. By 5:30, the parking lot was already full. Becca and I sat in her car watching people file in. I recognized most of them, neighbors, church members, business owners. The entire town had turned out. They think this is about the church expansion, Becca said. They think they're here to rubber stamp a building project. That's what makes this the perfect moment, I said. They can't avoid it. They can't pretend they didn't hear. At 5:45, I saw Michelle arrive with her husband. She caught my eye across the parking lot and gave a small nod. Sarah pulled up a few minutes later alone. She looked pale and determined. Ready? Becca asked. I picked up the folder containing copies of the journal entries, the financial records, the transcripts of Catherine's interview. Ready, we walked in together. The community center's main hall was packed, every seat taken, people standing along the walls. At the front, a table was set up for the city council members. To the side, in places of honor, sat Deacon Pritchard, Walter Gibson and Margaret Simmons. When I walked in, a murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw people whispering, pointing, the widow, the disturbed woman. I kept my head high and walked to an empty seat in the third row. Becca sat beside me. Michelle and Sarah were already seated in the front row, just as Sarah had promised. Mayor Henderson called the meeting to order at 6 sharp. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're here to discuss the proposed expansion of Redemption Falls Baptist Church. The church has submitted plans for a new fellowship hall and education wing, which will require city permits and zoning approval. We'll hear from the church leadership, then open the floor for public comment. Deacon Pritchard stood to present the church's proposal. He was eloquent, persuasive, painting a picture of a growing congregation that needed space to serve the community better. He talked about James's vision for the church, how this expansion was a tribute to his legacy. Pastor Hartwell dreamed of a church that could serve generations to come. Deacon Pritchard said, his voice ringing through the hall. A place where families could grow in faith, where the lost could find hope, where God's love could shine through this community. This expansion is how we honor his memory and continue his work. People applauded. I felt sick. When he finished, the mayor opened the floor for public comment. Anyone who wishes to speak, please come to the microphone and state your name for the record. Several people spoke in favor of the expansion. Business owners who thought it would be good for the town. Church members who praised James's legacy. A teacher who talked about how the church's youth programs had helped struggling kids. Each testimony felt like a knife. These people genuinely believed in the church, in James, in the good he'd done. They had no idea what that goodness had cost. Finally, the mayor asked, any other comments? I stood up. My legs felt weak, but I walked to the microphone at the center of the aisle. Every eye in the room fixed on me. My name is Clara May Hartwell, I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected. I'm Pastor James Hartwell's widow. We know who you are, dear, someone called out. A few people laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Then you'll understand why I'm here to speak against this expansion. The room went deadly silent, because before we build a monument to my husband's legacy, this town needs to know the truth about who he really was. Clara, this isn't appropriate. Deacon Pritchard started to stand. Sit down, the mayor said sharply. Mrs. Hartwell has the floor. I opened my folder with shaking hands. 6 weeks ago, I found a journal in my late husband's locked desk drawer. It contained detailed records of what James called private counseling sessions with women from our congregation. These weren't counseling sessions. They were opportunities for manipulation, blackmail, and abuse. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was louder now, angry and disbelieving. That's a lie. Someone shouted from the back. I have the journal here. I continued. I have financial records showing that James extorted over $43,000 from these women over 5 years. I have testimony from his victims. And I have recordings of church leadership admitting they knew about this and chose to cover it up. This is slander. Walter Gibson was on his feet now. James Hartwell is dead and cannot defend himself against these vicious lies. Then let me defend the truth, I said. I pulled out a copy of a journal entry and began to read, carefully keeping the woman's name redacted. January 2009, she confessed to having feelings for someone else. I used this to establish my authority over her. She will prove her repentance through increased donations and absolute discretion. Does that sound like counseling to you? I read another entry, then another. With each one the mood in the room shifted. Shock. Confusion. Some anger directed at me, but increasingly, I saw people looking at the church elders with new suspicion. These are taken out of context. Margaret Simmons shouted. Clara is grieving, she's mentally unwell. I have victims willing to testify, I interrupted. Catherine Wells, who moved to Macon to escape my husband's manipulation. Michelle Crane, who is here tonight. Michelle stood up slowly. Every head swiveled toward her. She was shaking, but she stayed standing. Michelle, you don't have to do this, Tom Crane said, grabbing her hand. But she pulled away gently. Yes, I do. Her voice was barely audible, but in the shocked silence everyone heard. Pastor Hartwell counseled me for 3 years. He used my past against me. He made me pay money to keep my secrets. He made me believe I deserved it. Tears streamed down her face. And I stayed silent because I was ashamed. But I'm done being ashamed of someone else's sin. Sarah stood up next. She didn't speak, just stood there, her presence a testimony. Then, from the back of the room, someone else stood. Jennifer Morrison, the woman who'd screamed at me on the phone. She was crying but standing. Another woman stood, then another. By the time they finished, 7 women were on their feet, scattered throughout the room, each one a silent accusation. The crowd erupted. Some people were shouting at me, calling me a liar, a traitor. Others were shouting at the elders, demanding answers. Husbands were looking at their wives with confusion and dawning horror. The mayor was banging his gavel, trying to restore order. Deacon Pritchard's voice cut through the chaos. Even if some of these allegations have merit, this is not the time or place. When is the time? I demanded. When you've successfully changed the locks on the parsonage and disposed of the evidence. When you've silenced every woman who might speak out. When you've built your expansion and cemented James's legacy so thoroughly that the truth can never emerge. The truth, Walter Gibson said coldly, is that you're a bitter woman trying to destroy your husband's good name. The truth, Becca said, standing up and coming to join me at the microphone, is that I have recordings of your meeting with Clara last Tuesday, where you admitted you knew about the journal, where you threatened her housing, her reputation, and the women who might support her, where you made it clear you would do anything to protect the church's reputation instead of the people it hurt. She held up a small digital recorder. Would you like me to play it for everyone? The elders' faces went white. This meeting is out of order, the mayor said, still banging his gavel. We're here to discuss a building permit, not to air private grievances. These aren't private grievances, I said. This is about whether Redemption Falls will knowingly build a monument to a man who hurt vulnerable women. This is about whether we value reputation more than truth. This is about whether any woman in this town will ever feel safe seeking help from church leadership again. I've heard enough, someone called from the crowd. It was Tom Crane, Michelle's husband. He stood up, his face twisted with pain and rage. If even half of what Clara is saying is true, then we can't vote on this expansion. Not until there's been a full investigation. I agree, said another voice. Sarah's ex-husband, standing beside her even though they'd been divorced for 2 years. My wife has been carrying weight I didn't understand. If Pastor Hartwell did this to her, to any of these women, then we need answers before we spend another dime on his legacy. The tide was turning. I could feel it. Not everyone believed me. Some people were still shouting their support for James, for the church. But doubt had been planted. Questions were being raised. The perfect fuckhead was cracking. The mayor called for a vote on tabling the church expansion pending an independent investigation. It passed narrowly. The elders sat in their chairs looking like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. As the meeting dissolved into arguments and heated conversations, I walked back to my seat. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed into the chair, shaking. Becca put her hand on my shoulder. You did it. Did I? I looked around at the chaos, at Michelle crying in her husband's arms, at Sarah being questioned by what looked like half the congregation. I may have just destroyed this entire town. No, Sarah said, appearing beside me. Her face was tear-stained but calm. You freed it. You freed us. The aftermath took months to sort out. The state attorney general opened an investigation into the church's finances. A victims' advocacy group came in to offer counseling and support to the women James had manipulated. The elders were forced to resign. Several families left the church entirely. Others stayed and fought to rebuild it into something healthier. I moved into a small apartment above the bookstore on Main Street, lost my place in the church, just as the elders had promised. But I also found something I hadn't expected: a community of women who'd been silenced and were now learning to speak. We met every Thursday morning, no formal structure, just coffee and conversation and the slow process of healing. Becca stayed in town longer than she'd planned. Her article about James and the church cover-up was picked up by a major newspaper. It won awards. But more importantly, it sparked conversations in churches across the state about accountability, about the danger of unchecked authority, about how to protect the vulnerable. Michelle and Tom went to marriage counseling. Real counseling, with a licensed therapist 2 towns over. Last I heard, they were working through it, rebuilding trust one day at a time. Sarah reconciled with her daughter. Emma came home from college and spent a weekend in that Thursday morning group, just listening. She told her mother she was proud of her. It was a start. As for me, I learned to live with the complicated truth that the man I loved never really existed. The James I married was a fiction, a performance. The real James was someone I never knew, and I'm grateful I didn't. 6 months after the town hall meeting, I drove past Redemption Falls Baptist Church. The faux R-cell sign in front made me sad and relieved in equal measure. The congregation had split, half forming a new church with new leadership committed to transparency and accountability, half joining other congregations in neighboring towns. The building was just a building. The faith it housed had moved on. I pulled over and sat looking at it for a while, this place that had been my home and my prison. Then I drove away, leaving it behind like everything else from that old life. These days, people still argue about what happened. Some believe James was a monster. Others think he was a flawed man who made mistakes. Still others believe I made the whole thing up out of grief and spite. I've stopped trying to convince anyone. The truth is in the journal, in the testimony, in the lives of the women who are slowly, painfully, learning to reclaim their stories. And me, I'm learning that freedom isn't comfortable. It doesn't feel safe or certain, but it's mine. For the first time in my life, it's entirely mine. My name is Clara May Hartwell. I was a pastor's widow, a keeper of secrets, a woman who stayed silent for too long. Now I'm just Clara, and that's enough. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you or someone you know has experienced spiritual abuse or manipulation by someone in authority, please know it's not your fault. You're not alone, and there are people who will believe you. Don't let shame keep you silent. The truth, no matter how painful, is always worth telling. Please subscribe if this story moved you, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, this is Granny's Truths, reminding you that the truth may hurt, but silence hurts more.